If I asked you to picture a millionaire, what comes to mind? Probably someone in a sharp suit, a corner office, a title with words like executive or director in front of it, a salary with a lot of zeros earned through some impressive, high-status career. That image feels obvious. It feels like common sense. High income eventually becomes high net worth. That's the formula, right? Here's what's strange. When researchers actually went and studied real millionaires, not celebrities, not tech founders, not the people who show up in headlines, but ordinary millionaires, the quiet kind, who actually exist in large numbers across the country, the picture that came back looked almost nothing like the one in your head. Most of them never earned six figures. Many of them worked completely ordinary jobs: teachers, accountants, small business owners, government employees, people whose income, by most standards, would be described as comfortable but unremarkable. So if it's not the income, what is it? And what does that actually mean for the rest of us, who've been quietly assuming that the path to real wealth requires a salary we don't currently have? This research isn't speculation. It comes from one of the most thorough studies ever done on actual millionaires in America, originally published in the book The Millionaire Next Door. The researchers went looking for wealthy people the way most of us imagine them, through luxury car dealerships, upscale neighborhoods, expensive private clubs. And they kept finding something unexpected. The people actually living in the expensive houses and driving the luxury cars often had surprisingly little in savings or investments. Meanwhile, many of the people with substantial wealth lived in completely ordinary homes, drove cars that were several years old, and would be invisible if you passed them on the street. The core misunderstanding here is that we've confused two completely different things: looking rich and being wealthy. They're not the same, they're not even closely related. In fact, in many cases, they move in opposite directions. Looking rich is about spending. It's visible. It's the watch, the car, the renovated kitchen, the vacations posted online. Being wealthy is about what's left after spending, the part that gets saved, invested, and allowed to grow quietly in the background where nobody can see it. And here's the part that should genuinely change how you think about your own financial path. A high income makes wealth easier to build, but it doesn't make it automatic. In fact, high income often creates the exact behavioral trap that prevents wealth from forming at all, because higher income tends to come with higher visibility, higher social expectations, and a stronger pull towards spending that matches the image of success rather than the substance of it. Let's actually look at why this happens, because the mechanics are more interesting than the surface-level idea of rich people overspend. The first factor is what's called relative spending pressure. The more someone earns, the more their social and professional environment shifts toward people who spend at a higher level. A doctor earning $300,000 a year is surrounded by colleagues with expensive homes, private school tuition, and country club memberships. Matching that environment doesn't feel like excess, it feels like the baseline. Meanwhile, someone earning $70,000 a year, working a stable job in an ordinary community, often has a social environment where moderate spending is completely normal. There's far less pressure pulling money out of their hands. The second factor is something researchers call the income as identity trap. When someone earns a high income, that income often becomes tied to their sense of self. Spending in a way that reflects that income, the right car, the right neighborhood, the right vacations, starts to feel less like a choice and more like a requirement. Not spending at that level can feel like a kind of identity threat, even if no one around them would actually judge them for it. Now, compare that to the millionaires the original research actually found. A huge proportion of them shared a specific set of behaviors that had nothing to do with how much they earned and everything to do with how they handled what they earned. They lived below their means consistently, not occasionally. Not as a temporary sacrifice during a tough year, but as a permanent, almost invisible habit. They prioritized investing early and let time do the heavy lifting rather than trying to catch up later with larger, more dramatic contributions. They typically owned businesses or had stable, unglamorous careers where the income, while solid, wasn't spectacular, but the gap between what came in and what went out was wide and consistent. Here's where the simple math becomes genuinely persuasive. Someone earning $70,000 a year who consistently invests 20% of their income, about $14,000 annually, into a basic diversified portfolio averaging a reasonable long-term return can realistically accumulate over $1 million across a 30 to 35-year career. Not through extraordinary returns, not through some insider strategy, just through consistency and time. Meanwhile, someone earning $200,000 a year who spends nearly all of it maintaining a lifestyle that matches their income rather than living meaningfully below it, can reach retirement age with a fraction of that, despite having earned nearly 3 times as much over their lifetime. The income was never the deciding factor. The gap between income and spending was. And that gap is something almost anyone at almost any income level has some ability to influence, which is a very different story than the one most of us have been telling ourselves. Here's the realization that actually matters, and it's one that I think quietly removes a lot of pressure for people who've assumed wealth was out of reach because their income isn't extraordinary. If wealth depended primarily on income, then most people would be permanently locked out of it by circumstances outside their control, their career choice, their industry, the ceiling of their profession. That would be genuinely discouraging, because income, especially in the short term, isn't always something you can dramatically change. But if wealth depends primarily on the relationship between income and spending, on the gap, and on what happens to that gap over time, then the entire picture shifts. Because that gap is something almost everyone has some influence over, regardless of what they currently earn. This doesn't mean income doesn't matter at all. Obviously, more income makes the gap easier to create, but it does mean that the absence of a 6-figure salary is not the disqualifying factor most people assume it is. The real determining factor is something quieter and far less dramatic. Consistency, applied over a long period of time, protected from the pressure to spend at the level your income or your environment suggests you should. That's a much more accessible path than the one most people picture when they imagine becoming wealthy. It doesn't require a breakthrough. It doesn't require a different career. It requires a different relationship with the money you already have coming in. If there's one number worth focusing on after watching this, it's not your income. It's your savings rate, the percentage of what you earn that actually gets set aside and invested rather than spent. Start by figuring out what that number currently is, honestly. Most people have never actually calculated it and are surprised, in either direction, when they do. From there, the goal isn't to dramatically overhaul your life overnight. It's to slowly and deliberately widen the gap between what comes in and what goes out. That might mean automating a percentage of every paycheck into an investment account before you ever see it, so the spending decision is never even presented to you. It might mean being honest about which expenses are genuinely meaningful to you and which ones exist mainly because they match an image you feel pressured to maintain. It also helps to remember that this works regardless of your current income level. Whether you're earning $50,000 or $150,000, the same principle applies. The size of the gap matters more than the size of the income, and the earlier that gap is created and protected, the more time compound growth has to do the rest of the work, quietly, in the background, without requiring any more effort from you than the original decision to save it.